Right, so for our second speaker, as Tom already said at the start, Sahar Shah, my namesake, is not here today, so I will play her recording of her paper in a second, but to introduce her. So Sahar is a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Warwick's Law School, studying Indigenous environmental and climate justice movements in Canada. She is also a contract law graduate teaching assistant and is involved with several university-wide teaching initiatives. She has co-organized several academic events, including a two-day climate justice-focused conference and a workshop on anti-colonial critiques of carbon pricing organized in conjunction with the Indigenous Environmental Network. Sahar will be presenting her paper called Lines and Land Laws, Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and the Disruption of Legal Taxonomies. So if you'll bear with me a second, I will just share her video now.
I'm going to start with an argument made by Audra Simpson that the colonial project in Canada rests on the domination of Indigenous women. A fairly sonorous statement to begin with, but in this presentation, I'll unpack this a little bit and examine how it is intertwined with the settler state's legal treatment of land. So Silvia Federici has demonstrated in the European context that when societies move from systems of land with expansive access to commons to those predicated upon individual ownership, the social roles of women become severely circumscribed and subordinated to those of men. The centering of private property norms and male ownership and inheritance, crucially, of this property necessitates a nuclear family premised on a heterosexual monogamous marriage in which the man is the head of the household. This phenomenon is visible in the context of the colonial settlement of Canada. Historical texts show the visceral disgust and fear that early colonial and religious officials felt upon encountering the so-called promiscuity of Indigenous women, constructed against the benchmark of Christian sexual and gendered values at the time. And the sense of contempt that they felt seems to have been deeply intertwined with their simultaneous contempt for the clan and community-based relational structures in many Indigenous societies that lent themselves to communal stewardship of land and resources. Audra Simpson explains how these two relate, noting that, for example, Iroquois and Haudenosaunee women were the inverse of the settler colonial woman. They had legally mandated authority and power, and so they represented an alternative to the political and economic orders that were coming into play in the late 19th century Western world. And therefore, in settler regimes such as the US and Canada, Indigenous women's bodies became loaded with meaning, signifying land itself, and most dangerously, other political orders, other life forms, and other sovereignties. So what did this process involve legally? The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 can be seen as the first large-scale organized effort of the Canadian government to survey and section off land through the imposition of grid-like divisions on land, as we see on the screen. If we imagine the previous image as Indigenous governance structures and lands as they existed prior to colonial contact, and the grid as a representation of the Dominion Lands Act and survey. Free parcels of land through this process of 160 acres each were offered to European settlers willing to establish homesteads on them. 1.25 million homesteads were made available over an expanse of around 80 million hectares, making this the largest survey grid in the world. These settlement invitations were extended broadly to all white European men over the age of 18, as well as in some circumstances, white women that were heads of a household. The processes by which this land was to be claimed were textbook Lockean. Securing title through settlement was contingent upon improvements made to the plot after a homestead had been established on it. As part of the survey, as you can see on this grid on the screen, which shows an example township divvied up, lands were also reserved for railway companies, the Hudson's Bay Company, which was the company that played a pivotal role in the settlement and colonization of Canada, and relatively few assigned to school boards in each township. The purpose of the systematic approach to settlement was to assert control over land in order to stave off US encroachment and consolidate Canadian sovereignty. So sovereignty and property rights converge here in the word settlement. This in turn facilitated the construction of the legal fiction of underlying crown title to all lands within the borders of Canada, which survives in land law today, both in Aboriginal land law and the colonial treatment of Aboriginal Aboriginal land rights and property rights, etc. To accomplish this, the Canadian state, or the fledgling Canadian state, needed the invested labor and some sort of buy-in from settlers distributed over a vast expanse of land, as well as some method of dispossession and conversion of Indigenous groups. Securing buy-in from settlers was at least in part an affective process involving the construction and imposition of a moral framework, the intertwinement of Lockean ethics and Christian family values, as well as material individuated forms of incentivization directed to specific groups. Free land, for instance, as we discussed earlier, or in predating systems, payments offered in exchange for settlement. Scholars like Aaron Morton explain how the romantic, moral, and visual construction of the settler homesteader, working away at his plot to provide for his family, made its way into the individual psyches of settlers in specific regions of the fledgling state, enabling them to justify violence against Indigenous groups that posed any kind of perceived threat to their homesteads. This in turn could effectuate state violence to protect the rights of the homesteaders. Historically, Indigenous women became the legal targets of the inverse of this moralizing. For instance, the potlatch ban of 1885 was broadly the product of settler horror at what they saw as wanton sharing of valuable items in these gift-giving ceremonies practiced by Indigenous groups in what's today known as Western Canada. In these ceremonies, items considered valuable in the settler market, such as the iconic Hudson's Bay Company blanket, were not treated as settlers felt that personal property should be, i.e. they weren't sold, they were simply given away and shared in large quantities, thus devaluing them. Proponents of the potlatch ban used the fabricated notion that Indigenous women were being traded in these ceremonies to secure public support for banning the ceremony, thus leveraging sexual morality against Indigenous women in order to entrench property norms. The Indian Act of 1876, following on 4 years after the Dominion Lands Act, among other things, rendered Indigenous women the property of their husbands. So I'm going to jump now jarringly to 2019 due to time constraints, just leaving out the entire 20th century, which was crucial in terms of political, ideological, and activist developments. But in a sort of time constrained situation, it's still interesting to see the early colonization of Canada sort of set directly alongside modern day. So jumping to 2019, Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women has illustrated the ways in which Canadian law continues to be characterized by racial and gendered violence today. Their 2019 report, comprising several parts, was the result of an inquiry commissioned to investigate the endemic levels of violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada that had been murdered, faced sexual violence, or had altogether disappeared. This phenomena had been observed for decades, but the inquiry was only commissioned in the late 2010s, in 2016 specifically, as a result of years of campaigning from Indigenous communities and activist groups. The inquiry report argues in no uncertain terms that the colonial capitalist system is structured to cause ongoing violence against Indigenous women by separating Indigenous people from their lands, making the seemingly radical claim that this constitutes an ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls. So if we look back to the sort of the construction of underlying crown title to Indigenous land, it's important to note that the gold layer is imperfect because this indicates that the Canadian state was never able to perfect the fabric of sovereignty with which it attempted to shroud Indigenous lands, laws, and epistemologies. There are holes in this fabric, as you can see on the screen. Sherry Pasternak conceptualizes the sovereignty of the Canadian state as a fabric with conspicuous holes, faults, and imperfections. Because settlement did not complete its acquisitive project in the past, it continues to acquire and to suppress in the present. So settler colonialism, as Coulthard argues, is territorially acquisitive in perpetuity. This is in part why, to return to Audra Simpson's argument set out at the beginning of this presentation, the colonial settler apparatus relies on the continued disappearance of Indigenous women. The disappearance of Indigenous women is a necropolitical element of the settler state's structure. So where can we see this acquisitive action in the law today, where we saw it originally in the Dominion Lands Act, for example? Where is it today particularly distilled, visible, and highlighted? Among other things, the report explains, as ecofeminists have long argued, that resource extraction in particular drives violence against Indigenous women and girls in many ways. Beyond the psychosocial and philosophical connections between extracting from nature and violence against women, the report highlights empirical evidence of increases in sexual violence in proximity to sites of environmental extraction, linked to transient workers, harassment and assault in the workplace, rotational shift work, substance abuse and addictions, and economic insecurity. This empirical demonstration of what was already sort of understood philosophically through ecofeminist lenses creates a point of epistemological convergence between the empirical-based epistemology of the Canadian state and Indigenous epistemologies that would have understood these connections in different ways. The establishment of man camps at remote sites of construction have come to symbolize this connection, and this term, as you can see from the headlines on the screen, has made its way into popular discourse in the last 2 years, particularly in the Canadian media. While the Canadian federal state, for example, as embodied by current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, has rhetorically accepted the findings of this report, including the group's claim that in aggregate, the government's actions amount to an ongoing genocide, though note the crucial temporal framing here. Trudeau himself has nevertheless served to reinforce the very structures that the report critiques. This headline, to me, energetically and aesthetically embodies Audra Simpson's argument that the state is a man. In this case, the article tells us Indigenous groups and allies protesting the construction of a pipeline through Indigenous land were given several days to consent to dismantling their blockade, and accordingly to the infringements, incursions, and invasions that they were protesting. But while they were allowed to consent, what they were not allowed to do is refuse these incursions. When they attempted to refuse, this headline tells us, Trudeau lost his patience. And the tone of this article in the headline seems to ascribe a sense of rectitude to this, as well he should have, it seems to tell us. It alludes to an initial position of morality, his patience, which was then overcome by the irrational and harmful behavior of the Indigenous protesters. This dynamic is also illustrative of the operation of sovereign power over Indigenous land today. The contemporary articulations of force relating to Indigenous people and lands are nebulous and diffuse today, mired in governmentality, ideology, and morality. But when these processes fail to secure the state's acquisitive objectives, when Indigenous groups refuse acquisition and incursion, particularly when they do so from the basis of their own epistemological, legal, and moral orders, the sovereign will exert obvious force for projects that it deems crucial enough to the national interest, often relating to the exploitation of oil and gas reserves in the Alberta tar sands and related projects. I think this image on the screen of the blockade against which Trudeau lost his patience is very emblematic of this dynamic. The force exerted against Indigenous groups, particularly women, defending land against incursions by the state has also taken the form of police and military invasions in which officers were authorized to use lethal force against defenders that were deemed unlikely to use force themselves. This image is symbolically striking as it shows RCMP officers enforcing an injunction against Indigenous land defenders against a backdrop of red dresses hung to commemorate missing and murdered Indigenous women. So while processes of legal abstraction render the quotidian operation of force against Indigenous groups today diffuse, if we trace these diffuse threads to essential points of conflict over essential swathes of land, which is again the irreducible element of settler colonialism, as Coulthard says, the force enacted by the sovereign becomes almost cartoonish, as demonstrated in this image, a dynamic which is also explained by theorists of sovereignty such as Carl Schmitt. This is why the MMIWG calls the relational dynamic of the state a genocide against Indigenous women and girls. The use of this language shows that this force is not only the most extreme manifestation of force broadly and universally accepted, but it is also intentional, which subverts the legal and political rhetoric that force against Indigenous groups in Canada happened in the colonial past. And when it happens now, it's attributable to the failings of law rather than the purpose of law. So one thing thing the MMIWG report does is render this sovereign force visible and inelegant. Another thing it does is elucidate the metaphysical imperfections of the settler state's understanding of land. In Canadian laws related to land, we see a compartmentalization of the laws that govern land and space that can be analogized to the grid-like structures and compartmentalizations imposed upon land itself. Strands of law relating to land, like geographic demarcations, are categorized in ways that begin to seem natural and necessary over time. For instance, those that are recognized as applicable to land, such as those on the screen, public and private ownership of property, corporate rights to extraction, colonial laws governing Indigenous rights to land, environmental and natural resource law, and then in completely unconnected compartments, laws relating to gender and racial equality. The MMIWG report gives us a lens that once we look through it, makes certain aspects of this compartmentalization appear arbitrary and inadequate, in line with Foucault's argument about epistemes and taxonomies. But these insights emerge from epistemologies necessarily obscured by the imposition of crown title, a legal fiction over Indigenous lands, taking as axiomatic here Leanne Simpson's assertion that both Indigenous and settler colonial epistemologies are inextricably linked with specific material relationships with land. From this perspective, we need to move away crown title in order to see the faults of the settler colonial structure, given that the connections and insights of the report emerged from Indigenous epistemologies inextricably linked with land.
Right, so thank you, Sahar, in absentia.